The main entrance to the enclosure was past. It was a heavy wooden gate, framed in iron and locked, with the cargo of the launch piled outside it, and at the corner we came to a small doorway. The white-haired man produced a bundle of keys from the pocket of his greasy blue jacket, opened this door, and entered. I followed him, and found myself in a small apartment, plainly but not uncomfortably furnished, and with its inner door, which was slightly ajar, opening into a paved courtyard. This inner door Montgomery at once closed. This, the white-haired man told me, was to be my apartment, and the inner door, which, for fear of accidents, he said, he would lock on the other side, was my limit inward. He left the room by the outer door, as if to avoid opening the inner one again. Montgomery went out after the other. "Moreau!" I heard him call. Where had I heard the name of Moreau before? Maling, Montgomery's ungainly attendant, came in, carrying a little tray with some coffee and boiled vegetables thereon. I could hardly repress a shuddering recoil as he placed the tray before me on the table. Then astonishment paralyzed me. Under his stringy black locks, I saw his ear. It jumped upon me suddenly close to my face. The man had pointed ears, covered with a fine brown fur. "Your breakfast, sir?" he said. By some odd trick of unconscious cerebration, there came surging into my head the phrase, "The Moreau Horrors." I saw it in red lettering, on a little buff-coloured pamphlet that came back with startling vividness to my mind. I'd been a mere lad then. Moreau was a prominent physiologist, well known in scientific circles for his extraordinary imagination and his brutal directness in discussion. Was this the same Moreau? He'd published some astonishing facts in connection with the transfusion of blood, and in addition was known to be doing valuable work on morbid growths. Then suddenly his career was closed. A journalist obtained access to his laboratory with the deliberate intention of making sensational exposures, and by the help of an accident, his gruesome pamphlet became notorious. On the day of its publication, a wretched dog, flayed and otherwise mutilated, escaped from Moreau's house. It was the silly season, and a prominent editor appealed to the conscience of the nation. The doctor was simply howled out of the country. It dawned upon me to what end the puma and the other animals were destined, and a curious faint odour that had been in the background of my consciousness hitherto suddenly came forward into the forefront of my thoughts. It was the antiseptic odour of the dissecting room. What could it all mean? A locked enclosure on a lonely island, a notorious vivisector, and these crippled and distorted men. A sharp, hoarse cry of animal pain came from the enclosure. The puma. The cries grew in depth and intensity as the day wore on, grew at last to such an exquisite expression of suffering that I could stand it in that confined room no longer. It was as if all the pain in the world had found a voice. I stepped out into the slumberous heat of the afternoon, striding through the undergrowth that clothed the ridge behind the house, then descending towards a streamlet that ran through the narrow valley. I began to turn over in my mind again the strange peculiarities of Montgomery's man, but it was too hot to think elaborately, and presently I fell into a tranquil state midway between dozing and waking. From this I was aroused by a rustling amidst the greenery. Suddenly, upon the bank of the stream appeared something. It bowed its round head to the water, and began to drink. Then I saw it was a man, going on all fours like a beast. I could hear the suck of the water at his lips as he drank. He looked up guiltily, and his eyes met mine. Forthwith he scrambled to his feet and slunk off among the bushes. I regretted that I was unarmed. Every shadow became an ambush, every rustle a threat. I resolved to go back to the enclosure and thrust myself frantically through the bushes, anxious to get a clear space about me again. I stopped just in time to prevent myself emerging upon a glade. Before me, Squatting together upon the ruins of a huge fallen tree were 3 grotesque figures. One was evidently a female, the other 2 were men. Their skins were of a dull pinkish drab colour, such as I had seen in no savages before. They had fat, heavy, chinless faces, retreating foreheads, and a scant bristly hair upon their heads. All 3 began slowly to circle round, raising and stamping their feet and waving their arms. I perceived that each of these creatures, despite its rag of clothing and the rough humanity of its bodily form, had woven into it some suggestion of a hog. I turned as noiselessly as possible and pushed back into the bushes. My only idea for the moment was to get away from these foul beings, and I scarcely noticed that I had emerged upon a faint pathway. Then suddenly I saw, with an unpleasant start, 2 clumsy legs among the trees, walking parallel with my course. Looking hard, I distinguished through the interlacing network the head and body of the brute I had seen drinking. "Who are you?" said I. He tried to meet my gaze. "No," he said suddenly, and turning, went bounding away from me through the undergrowth. For the first time I realized how the lateness of the hour might affect me. The thought of a return to the pain-haunted enclosure was extremely disagreeable, but still more so was the idea of being overtaken in the open by darkness, and all that darkness might conceal. I began to be tormented by a faint rustling upon my right. I increased my pace, and after some time came to a slight ridge, crossed it, and turned sharply. Presently a shapeless lump heaved up momentarily against the skyline and vanished again. I felt assured now that my tawny-faced antagonist was stalking me once more, and coupled with that was another unpleasant realization, that I had lost my way. I heard the sound of the sea. I quickened my footsteps almost into a run, and immediately there was a stumble in my rear. I could see the thing rather more distinctly now. It was no animal, for it stood erect. My foot struck a stone. Without taking my eyes off the black form before me, I stooped and picked up this lump of rock. But at my motion, the thing turned abruptly, as a dog might have done, and slunk obliquely into the further darkness. Then I recalled a schoolboy expedient against big dogs, and twisted the rock into my handkerchief and gave this a turn round my wrist. I ran near the water's edge, and heard every now and then the splash of the feet that gained upon me. I perceived the thing would come up with me long before I reached the enclosure, and, desperate and sobbing for my breath, I wheeled round upon it, and struck at it as it came up to me. The stone came out of the sling of the handkerchief as I did so. The thing, which had been running on all fours, rose to its feet, and the missile fell fair on its left temple. The animal man fell headlong upon the sand with its face in the water, and there it lay still. As I drew near the house, I heard the voice of Montgomery shouting, "Prendick!" I replied by a feeble, "Hello," and in another moment had staggered up to him. "Where have you been?" said he, holding me at arm's length. "For God's sake," said I, "fasten that door." "You've been meeting some of our curiosities, eh?" said he. "Tell me what it all means," said I, in a state bordering on hysterics. Montgomery put his hand on my shoulder. "Look here, Prendick," he said. "I had no business to let you drift out into this silly island of ours, but it's not so bad as you feel, man. Your nerves are worked to rags. Let me give you something. You must simply get to sleep, or I won't answer for it." I bowed forward, and covered my face with my hands. Presently he returned with a small measure containing a dark liquid. This he gave me. I took it unresistingly, and he helped me into the hammock. When I awoke, it was broad day. The door behind me, the door inward towards the yard of the enclosure, stood somewhat ajar. A sound came from within, but this time it was not the puma. Though it was faint and low, there was no doubt at all of its source, for it was groaning, broken by sobs and gasps of anguish. It was a human being in torment. In 3 steps I had crossed the room, seized the handle of the door into the yard, and flung it open before me. There was blood in the sink, and the smell of carbolic acid. Through an open doorway beyond, I saw something bound painfully upon a framework, scarred, red and bandaged. And then blotting this out appeared the face of old Moreau, white and terrible. In a moment he had gripped me by the shoulder, twisted me off my feet, and flung me headlong back into my own room. The door slammed. I picked myself up and stood, trembling. Could it be possible, I thought, that such a thing as the vivisection of men was carried on here? I heard a step outside, flung open the door, and found Montgomery within a yard of it. He meant to lock the outer door. I turned and fled, round the corner of the house. "Prendick!" I heard his astonished cry. "Don't be a silly ass!"